Let's take a look at the cycle table, which by default is displayed at the top left-hand corner of your charts. You can move it if you like. I'll be showing you how in a moment. And you can see that this table displays in its default mode 3 columns. This first column on the left-hand side provides the name of the cycle. And you can see that, of course, our cycles are color-coded. You are familiar with that, I'm sure, by now. And so this is a 5-minute chart. Our shortest cycle is the 100-minute cycle, and our longest cycle is the 1-day cycle. The second column presents the sequence that applies to each one of the cycles in the first column. And so our 100-minute cycle experiences a sequence of interactions with price over the sequence cycle, which is of course the 6-hour cycle, as you can see over there. In the same way, the 3-hour cycle plays out over a 12-hour sequence, and the 6-hour cycle plays out over a 1-day cycle sequence. You will notice that the 2 longest cycles displayed on our chart do not include sequence information. That is because the sequence of interactions is not identified on this particular time frame. If you want to see the sequence of interactions for the 12-hour cycle or the 1-day cycle, you would simply need to move up to the next longer time frame. Then the third column is called the mode, which is a very useful piece of information because it presents us with the current mode of each one of the 3 longer cycles, from the 6-hour cycle up to the 1-day cycle on the 5-minute chart. This is a simple way of understanding what kind of a cycle shape we are expecting out of that particular cycle. That is really useful information because, of course, we are trading our M shape like this over here, and that is a perfectly neutral M shape that I have drawn on the chart. But if we were expecting a bullish M shape, such as this kind of a shape, then of course we would be focusing on entering into long trades with our signal cycle. And so this mode for the sequence cycle on each chart is going to prove particularly useful and important. The mode information for your sequence cycle, your green cycle on each chart, is the most important. The longer cycles is also of interest, but let me change time frame and point something out to you. This is a 4-hour chart, and as you can see, the current 80-day cycle, our yellow cycle on this chart, is marked as being in a bullish mode. However, notice that we have just experienced our 40-day cycle trough according to this analysis, and so therefore we are in the second part of our 80-day cycle. And so let's draw a bullish M shape over here, and we are currently at about this position over here. And so it is still useful to know that we are in a bullish cycle. But let me point out that when we are in this final leg down, the mode of our 80-day cycle will still be bullish. And yet, because we are in the final leg of that bullish cycle, it does not necessarily mean that we should still be only entering into long trades, because of course when it comes to the yellow cycle on our chart, if we are in the final leg of that move, then our sequence cycle is likely to be bearish because, of course, the market is moving down. And so we would probably be entering into short trades or looking for short trading opportunities, even though we have a bullish yellow-colored cycle on our chart. Taking a quick look at the cycle table on the NinjaTrader platform, the cycle table is consistent across all trading platforms that the Sentient FLD indicator is available for, but there are some specific details that apply to the NinjaTrader platform, so let's take a look at those. Here, of course, is our cycle table displayed at the top left of the chart. If we take a look at the indicator properties, there is an entire section of properties dedicated to the cycle table. These are the properties over here. So you can choose to show the cycle table or not by simply checking or unchecking that box over there. You can also define the position at which the table is plotted on your chart by defining an X and a Y coordinate for the top left-hand corner of the cycle table. The next input is for the table scale, and the one following that is for the font size. I mention these both together because they do in some ways work together. First of all, the font size is of course a standard font setting. The default number is 14, but you can change the font size and have a larger font or a smaller font. We'll play around with that in a moment. The table scale is a percentage value, and you can see by default it is 100. In other words, a 100% scale. If you're going to work with a larger font size, you would want to probably increase the scaling of the table. So let's do that. Let's clear these pen marks and let's assume that we want to have a larger font size. Let's change that to 18. And if we're increasing the font size, we will want to increase our table scale as well. Let's put that up to 150%. So it's going to present a larger table. Click on the OK button, and there you can see our larger font and larger scale table. It's going to be useful if you have a particularly high resolution monitor perhaps, and the scale of the table is just looking too small for you on your monitor, then you can adjust the scaling. Similarly, of course, we can display a smaller table, so let's do that. Let's reduce our font size to 10, and we'll reduce our table scale to something like 80%, and click on the OK button. And there is our very small table at the top left of our chart. That might be adequate for you, depending of course on your Windows settings and your screen resolution. But let's return that to normal for the sake of this video. The next setting, which is not checked by default, is to show what we call a complex table. So the complex table we're going to take a look at in a moment, so I'm going to check that. It provides us with more information about the cycle analysis. The other settings are to use cycle colors in the table, which is of course the default setting. If you choose not to use cycle colors, then the cycle table will be presented only in the label color, which is this color over here. You can see by default that is white. If you have pale background charts, you would probably want to change your label color to a darker color. Finally, the background color and the background opacity of the table we've spoken about before. You can define the color of the box that sits behind the table to separate it from the price action, and you can also change the opacity. It is a translucent table background and the default value is 60%. If you have a background opacity of 100%, then of course the table will sit on a completely solid rectangle. You won't see any price action behind it. So let's take a look at the complex table. Click on the OK button. And here is the complex table with, as you can see, an extra few columns. We will switch back to the MT4 platform to explain the details of the complex table. Here is our more complex table. Our first column and our fifth column and our final column, as you can see, are exactly the same information as is presented in the simple version of the table, with the cycle name, then the sequence cycle name, and then the mode. Our new columns in the complex table are this column over here, labeled NM. NM stands for nominal model, and when you watch the Hurst Cycles primer videos, you will understand what a nominal model is. These numbers are the number of bars for the wavelength of each one of these cycles. And so the 100-minute cycle has 20 bars as its wavelength. That is the number of bars defined in the nominal model. In other words, that is the average number of bars that we expect. Of course, we also know that there is something called the principle of variation, which tells us that these cycles are dynamic and their wavelengths are varying all the time. And that is what this next column is for over here. The column labeled CR. CR stands for current. And so this is the current wavelength of each one of these cycles. You can see that our 100-minute cycle has a current wavelength of 23 bars. In other words, 115 minutes. And the 3-hour cycle has a current wavelength of 46 bars, and so forth. You can see the principle of variation embodied in the fact that our current wavelength differs from our nominal or expected wavelength. And that difference is presented in the fourth column over here, which is titled VAR, that is for variation, and it tells us what the variation is between the current wavelength and the nominal or expected wavelength of each one of our cycles. You can see that all of our cycles are currently running 15% longer than normal. That is not unusual, it's not an extreme figure at all. A 15% variation is well within the bounds of normal cycle behavior. Switching quickly to the 1 hour chart, you can see another example where the variation of the different cycles does not exactly match. That is because what will often happen is that shorter cycles start compressing or expanding before the longer cycles, and so you will see fluctuations in the variation levels. You can see that these cycles vary from 6.8% up to 7.4%. Again, a very small variation compared to the nominal or average wavelength that we expect.